Good morning, everyone. We are going to continue with chapter number 13, Django forms. From that, we have seen about form classes and validations. In this session, we are going to continue with authentication. Here, authentication. Django authentication provides both authentication and authorization together and is generally referred to as the authentication system. Here, Django provides both authorization and authentication. Here, first see the user objects. Here, user objects are the core of the authentication system. User objects are the core of that authentication system. So that typically represents the people interacting with your site and are used to enable things like restricting access, registering user profiles, associating content with creators. So whenever we are going to create any one user, while creating that user, we are restricting access to that user. That means we are restricting particular user from accessing the files, registering the profiles, associating, like interacting with the files, interact with your site. So we are going to set some permissions, or we are going to authorize that we are going to set some IDs and password for that user. So here only one class of user exists in Django authentication framework is super user or admin or staff users. So Django authentication framework having the users like super users or admin or staff users. So staff users are just user objects with special attributes set, not different classes of user objects. In Django authentication framework, we are having super user or the staff users. So the primary attributes of that default users are like username, password, email, first name, and last name. So these are the primary attributes of that default user. Here now we will see the creating users. Here the most direct way to create users is to use the included create user helper function. See, this is the create user function, create user helper function for creating a user. So see how we are going to create a user here. From django.contrib.authentication.models import user. We are going to import the user module here from this. Then user is equals to user dot objects dot use create user helper function here, create user from user dot objects dot create user, and pass the parameters like username, email id, and the password. Okay, in this way we are going to create the username. We are going to create a user. After that, user dot last name, we are going to set that first name and last name here. Then user dot save, we are going to save that user here. By using create user function, we are going to create a user. Here see, from the Django.contrib.authentication models, we are going to import the user here. Then we are going to use the methods from that user like create user. Here see, user is equals to user dot objects dot create user helper function is there, and parameters for that, that is username, then email ID, and the password. After that, you can provide the first name and last name as well. Then user dot save. So here, if you have the Django admin install, you can also create users interactively. If you have installed that Django admin, then we can also create users interactively here. Then creating super users. Here we have seen creating users. Now how to create super users. So creating super user using the create super user command. We are having create super user command for creating super user. Here you can see create super user command for creating super user. Here you can write like python manage.py, then create super user. See the command for creating super user, python manage.py, create super user space double dash username is equals to username, and double dash email is equals to that email ID. So here you can see that you will be prompted for a password. After you enter one, the user will be created immediately. So if you leave off the username or the email options, it will prompt you for those values. Here you can see that creating super user having the username and the email ID. Here see python manage.py create super user command space double dash username is equals to give that username, for example like here Joe, then double dash email is equals to provide that email ID of that user. So using create user command, we can create a super user in Django. Then changing passwords. Here Django does not store the raw passwords on the user model. Django does not store raw passwords on the user model, but only a hash. It it stores the hash value of that password here. So because of this, do not attempt to manipulate the password attributes of the user directly. So this is why the helper function is used when creating a user. While we have seen that when we have created a user here using that helper function create user. Okay, so at that time here you can see that Django does not store the passwords. It stores only that hash value. Because of this, we do not attempt to manipulate the password attribute of the users directly. Here, to change the user passwords, you have several options like manage.py, change password, and the username. Here you can see that to change a user password like manage.py, change password, then see the change password command, then provide a username. So it offers a method for changing a user's password from the command line. From the command line, we can change the password like manage.py, then change password of that user. It offers a method for changing user's password from the command line. So it prompts you to change the password of a given user here. It prompts you to change the password of a given user, which you must enter twice here. We have to enter the password twice here. After writing the command manage.py, change password and the username. Here, if they both match, then the new password will be changed immediately. If you do not supply a user, the command will attempt to change the password whose username matches the current system user. You have to provide that username here. And we are going to change the password for that particular user here. After entering this command, manage.py, change password with the username, it will ask for the password twice. If that both password are matched, then the new password will be changed or that new password will be set. Or here, if you do not supply the username, then it command prompt will attempt to change the password whose username matches with the current system user. If you write command like only up to this, then it will change the password for the current user. Then you can also change a password programmatically using set password function. We have seen that how to change the password from the command line. Now we can change the password through program by using set password. Here you can see you can write from django.contrib.authentication.models. We have to import a user. Then here see u is equals to user.objects.get. What to get? Username. Username is equals to specify that username. Then user dot set password. Here you can see object u dot set password. We have to set password here in this bracket. You can write password and save this password u dot save. So by using set password function, you can set the password for that particular user in this way. We have to import the user from the django.contrib.authentication models. Then take one object u is equals to from the user class here user.objects.get that username and set the password like from the object u.set password and specify the password in the bracket. Then u.save. If you have the Django admin installed in your system, you can also change users password on the authentication system admin pages. If you have installed that Django admin, they can use if you have installed that Django admin in your system, you can change the username or use a password here, or you can create a user or change the password from the authentication systems admin page. So Django also provides views and forms that may be used to allow users to change their own passwords. Django also provides views and forms for changing a password. Then changing a user's password will log out all their sessions. If you have changed the password of that user, it will log out all their sessions because we have changed the password for that particular user. It will end the session of that user. Then authenticating users. Now here, see, for authenticating users, we are having a function like authenticate inside the bracket request is equals to none and the credentials. Here, use authenticate function to verify a set of credentials. To verify set of credentials, use authenticate function. Here it takes credential as keyword arguments. It takes parameters or the credentials as the keyword arguments, username and passwords for the default case. For default, by default, that credentials are username and password. It checks them against each authentication backend and returns a user object if the credentials are valid for a backend. If that it will, that authentication function changed, or sorry, that authentication authenticate method check with the credentials if that credentials, that is username and password, are match, then it will check for the, or it will check that authentication at the backend. If that, if the credentials are not valid for any backend, or if a backend raises permission denied, it returns none. If that credentials are not valid or not match, it will returns or it rises like permission denied. Here you can see the example for that, like from django.contrib.authentication, import, see the method authenticate. We have to import authenticate from this django.contrib.authentication. See here, user is equals to authenticate, and see the parameters here, credentials, username and password. Default credentials are keyword arguments, that is username and password for the authenticate function. If here you can see, if user means user is object having authenticate function with the credentials. If user is not none, that means at the backend it will authenticated the credentials. If user is not none, then we have to print a message, or then else print that message. Here you can see this, if user is not none, then you are going to print one message, you have to print one message, or else perform the operations, whatever you have. Then request, here you can see the request here, request is equals to none. Here request is an optional HTTP request which is passed on the authenticate method of the authentication backend. This is the optional part here for authenticate function. Here this is the optional part. We can pass the credentials for authenticate here like username and password. Here you can see the example for that credential authenticate function. Here we have to import authenticate from the django.contrib.authentication. We have taken one object user is equals to use authenticate here, authenticate, and pass the credentials as username and password. Here you can see if user is not none, then here you can see one message like here it will check the credentials, then else no backend authenticated credentials are there. Here you can see the request is optional part here. This is about authenticate function for authenticating users. Then permissions and authorizations. Here Django comes with built-in permission system. We are having built-in permissions. So it provides a way to assign permissions to specific users and group of users. We can assign permissions to specific users or and a group of users. So it is used by the Django admin side, but you are welcome to use it in your own code. You can set permissions in your own code. Here Django admin side uses the permissions like add, view, change, or delete. Here you can see that access to view objects is limited to users with the view. Access to view objects is limited to users with the view or change permissions for that type of objects. So your access to view the add form and add an object is limited to users with the add permissions for the type of objects. Then access to view the change list, view the change from view the change form, and change an object is limited to users with the change permissions. Then access to delete an object is limited to users with the delete permissions. So we are Django admin site having permissions like add, view, change, and delete. We are having four permissions. Then permissions can be set not only per type of objects but also per specific object instance. We can set the permissions to the specific object instance by using the has view permissions, has add permissions, has change permission, and has delete permission methods. That methods are provided by the model admin class. Here for the specific object instance, we can set the permissions to the specific object instance by using has view permissions, has add permissions, change per has change permissions, and has delete permission methods provided by the model admin class. So it is possible to customize permissions for the different object instances of the same type. We can set the permissions for the different object instances of the same type. Then the default permissions. So when Django.contrib.authentication is listed in your install app settings, we have seen that uh, when we are when that Django.contrib.authentication is listed in your install app settings, it will ensure that four default permissions, that is add, change, delete, and view, are created for each Django module defined in one of your install applications. These permissions are created for each Django module that is defined in your applications. So these permissions will be created when you run manage.py migrate. We have seen that for changing the whatever we have changed in your code, for changing that environment or for changing that modification we have done in the program. For that we are firing the command like manage.py migrate. It will migrate the changes we have done previously. Then here for these permissions will be created when we run manage.py migrate. So the first time you can run migrate after adding Django.contrib.authentication to install apps. The default permissions will be created for all previously installed modules. After running this command, the default permissions will be created for all previously installed modules as well as for any new modules being installed at that time. After running this command, it will create permissions for the default permissions will be created for previously installed apps or any newly installed app. Afterward, it will create default permissions for new modules each time. Here afterwards, it will create default permissions after running this command manage.py migrate. It will create default permissions for new modules each time you run manage.py migrate. Whenever we are running this command, it will create new permissions or it will set default permissions for new modules that are we are going to install. So the function creates permissions is connected to post migrate signal. So this is the default permissions. Yeah, see, you can assume you're assuming we are having an applications with the app label foo here and a model name is bar. So to test for basic permissions, you should use like add is colon user dot has permission. Here user dot has underscore permission in bracket foo dot add bar. Then here you can see for changing user dot has permission foo dot change bar, then foo dot delete bar and foo dot view bar for deleting and view. For delete user dot has permission foo dot delete bar, and for view user dot has permission foo dot view bar. So these are the four permissions, default permissions in Django. So that's it for today's session. We will stop here. Thank you.